Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to WatchBox, and thanks for logging on. If you're not watching this on the new WatchBox app, you're doing it all wrong. New features available on the Apple App Store or Google Play. You'll see WatchBox Studios content 1 week early, exclusive on the app. Plus, you can read editorial content from our own Jack Foster and your favorite third-party watch journals, magazines, and blogs. Also, shop our inventory, browse 3,000 pre-owned and vintage luxury watches while also storing your collection, including details of condition, box, and papers. Finally, stay in touch with me, my team, and our entire family of WatchBox client advisors around the world. I'm Tim, and I'll see you on the app.
Welcome back to Perpetually Patek. It's been a long time since we filmed our last episode, but I'm thrilled to be joined today by Tim Masso as we talk about advanced research models and all that they represent within the brand.
Yeah, I think what's interesting in the modern era, starting with the 2005 5250, is that for the first time in Patek Philippe history, we're seeing research and development happen in real time in public. With the perpetual calendars of the 40s, we didn't actually get to see the underlying engineering. The annual calendar arrived, it had already been patented. With the evolution of silicon through the 2000s, we're starting to see these kind of avant-garde technologies as something a consumer can partake of, to own a little piece of that moment in R&D.
Exactly. If we take a trip back to 2005, Mr. Thierry Stern wanted to start a department to showcase all of the pioneering that they were doing in these technologies. And that consummated in the advanced research department. And so primarily the focus of this department was researching and utilizing Silinvar, a derivative of silicone, to be used within their movements and then ultimately integrated into all the different product families. But it was such a novel application is that this Silinvar was anti-magnetic, it required less lubrication, it was less affected by heat and changes in temperature. And so from their perspective, this would drastically change, I think, the future of where they saw watchmaking going.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about it is that the technology itself was not exclusive. Through CSEM, a couple of companies had collaborated on the development of this technology with silicon and then deep reactive ion etching to actually microform these parts. The Swatch Group, Rolex, Patek Philippe, they had access to this technology, but Patek rolled it out first in watch movements, starting, of course, with the 5250, very simple Silinvar escape wheel. Let's take one part that runs relentlessly in the watch, reduce the friction, reduce the effect of temperature, reduce the effect of magnetism, and frankly, make it an objet art, because one element that I really love about the advanced research watches is that you do have a magnifier on the case back to appreciate the innovation. You can see it.
No, and so as we've seen before, Patek has always celebrated achievements or milestones with limited editions. And so these pieces in particular were achievements, and they were also done as limited editions. But if you go back to 2005, there wasn't as much press or fanfare around editions that were launching. So I think that these are often those little pieces of treasure that are being discovered, I wouldn't just say now, but probably within the last 3 to 5 years, of really special watches from the past that clients and collectors today are learning about now, both for their relevance today, but also the scarcity.
It's interesting because they're a great collection theme if you want to own important watches. A lot of people lose focus on them because they did trickle out over a long period of time. There wasn't a new edition every single year. They weren't sports watches. They were very traditional calendar dress models that were core to Patek's identity. But Patek jumped out ahead of its partners in getting this technology to market. Remember, Swatch didn't bring the silicon components to market till the 2010s, Rolex as well. And by 2006, Patek's already on its second iteration. They've got the escape wheel. Now they're arguably implementing silicon in the most important part of the watch, which is the hairspring. This is where you really start to get into, historic innovations in watchmaking, from alloys to curve profiles. Now you can have something that breathes like an overcoil with centered mass and concentric development, but it's also anti-magnetic, it's resistant to temperature fluctuations, and you've got that Spiromax that arrives in 2006 with the 5350. And that is the real breakthrough for me. If you would keep just one element, that is the most important evolution of this series from my standpoint.
And if we take a high-level approach, we had 2005 with the launch of the 5250. We had 2006 with the launch of the 5350, as you just mentioned. We had 2008 with the launch of the 5450. And 2011 with the launch of the 5550. And for me, I almost look at these as it's its own little series, even before the launches of the more recent advanced research pieces, because these came out in tandem to each other. They had similar characteristics, similar edition numbers, and one of the key characteristics of all four of these watches was that the advancements that were made for these four in particular were ultimately integrated into the other families of Patek Philippe over time.
Yeah, without a doubt. This was something that was done with mass production in mind, in the sense that 60,000 watches a year is mass production. But it was designed to be something, at least initially, that could improve all of the watches, which is why I say the Spiromax is probably the single greatest innovation, because from about 2011 we start to see that playing out across all of the model lines, not just the advanced research watches. The benefits were obvious. They were many. This was something that could be commercialized. It was durable enough to be in a sports watch as well as a dress watch. And that's why I really see that as the key innovation. But like you said, they didn't stop. They introduced, of course, what's called Pulsomax in 2008. This is where now you have the hairspring, but also both the lever and the escape wheel in silicon. And this is a real solution to a long-running problem, which is that you've got these sliding contact components in the escapement, and almost from the moment the watch leaves service, that lubrication is degrading and the friction is increasing. And a lot of times, the first thing to start degrading when a watch begins to lose time, keep erratic time, it is going to be that lubricated escapement. And so Patek just eliminated it with the 5450. And, it is worth mentioning some of the aesthetic changes. The original 5250, very silver white dial, white gold case.
5350 was rose gold with
Yes.
the vertical finish in silver dial. And then 5450, for me, one of the best iterations, the platinum with the salmon dial.
The pumpkin, as I like to call it. But yeah, that's a cool piece. And so you are seeing this evolution of technology that's practical. And then we see everything, the full boat. And I often tell people, while I think Spiromax with the 5350 was the most important of these innovations, if you're going to own just one of these watches,
5550.
get the 5550. 300 pieces, platinum.
First perpetual.
And the most attractive, frankly, rose gold hands and indices. For me, that's the best use of two-tone on a men's watch.
And you know what? I find it to be a very modern aesthetic, something that we would almost see the brand utilizing today, and it was using it back in 2011. And so I think that it's like a testament to the times of just how modern and advanced those watches were aesthetically relative to the rest of the collection, that you would almost fast forward 10 plus years for it to be a relevant watch today. But for me, which was even crazier, was just the overall, call it resale market of that watch for the longest time was at or around the retail price of the current perpetual for the time.
Well, it's not
which was to me just crazy. I mean, I think that watch overall and still to this day represents a lot of value for what it is you're getting, given just the aesthetic, the complication, the scarcity, and just the overall beauty of the watch.
Yeah, the rarest of these silicon-themed advanced research watches is going to be the 5250 because they made 100.
100 pieces.
The next three, they made 300 each. But with the Perpetual calendar, you get a couple things. First, the Perpetual, which is unique in this series. But then also the full boat, what they call a Silinvar. You get the lever and the escape wheel in silicon. You get the Spiromax hairspring, and you get Gyromax SI, which is a hybrid silicon and gold free-sprung balance. It takes the 1951 Gyromax free-sprung balance to the 21st century. And this has been a very rare feature. They don't roll this out too often. Spiromax is everywhere. There are a couple of watches with the silicon escapement. But Gyromax SI, off the top of my head, I think it's the 5550 and last year's 5470 chronograph. Those are the only places I can think of that balance being used. So the 5550 is a very unique watch. In addition to being a technical breakthrough, it's also very interesting from a scarcity
Why do you think that they
standpoint.
didn't integrate that out to more models?
Frankly, I think there are going to be questions about something that has so much inertia and mass loaded up on a silicon base. I think they wanted to test the durability long term. I think with the other parts, they have very little mass, and also they are mono materials. Whereas Gyromax SI, you've got this differential expansion and contraction of the metal and the silicon. And I think they wanted to see over the long term how that would age. And that was probably the part where they needed to do the most ... research that happens to be advanced.
And as you stated at the very beginning, like all of this research and development is done with not necessarily an end in sight in terms of when there will be application to product. And so we see that 2011, the 5550 launch, it wasn't for another 6 years that we had the launch of the next advanced research piece with the 5650, which was not only was the part presented for the first time, both from the front and the back, but it was also introduced on a sport model, the 5164, in white gold with blue coloring.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that it has shifted over time, that these are not just silicon-themed watches. Initially, they were. And if you want to get the production realization of that, any silicon hairspring Patek Philippe, or I've always said the 5235 regulators, because they give you everything except Gyromax SI. But now with the Aquanaut travel time, with the 5650G, we've got a watch that's a sports watch and not based on a new silicon technology, although it did debut the second generation Spiromax hairspring. For the most part, when we talk about the Aquanaut, we're talking about the compliant mechanism, which basically...
The travel time complication.
Exactly.
mechanism.
And it's a monoblock piece of metal, and just think of a leaf spring on a pickup truck. It flexes back and forth, but it doesn't necessarily have pivots. There's an elasticity to the material. And so by creating that elastic monoblock for the travel time triggers, you've now reduced the number of parts by 2/3, which has simplified it, but also made it thinner. I think the reason this is a bit of a quirky watch is the aesthetic, because technically speaking, it's masterful, but it is a controversial look.
I mean, I loved it. And so for me, I love the coloring. I love that it's white metal. It's got a lot more heft to it than your standard 5164. But one of the novel things about it was that there's only so much that the new mechanism can be utilized for within the catalog, right?
Yeah.
Like this was something that there wasn't really, clients or collectors weren't calling for it. This was, the watch already existed, it worked fine, people were happy with it. This was something that they knew that they could make it better, and they did. And so this was also an inflection period in just the overall market because you had a lot more online press around watches when this launched. You had social media was a much bigger, I would say, factor in terms of launches, as well as the spread of them. And this was the first time that we saw the very, very, very beginnings of this sort of Aquanaut Nautilus craze starting to take effect. And so for me, it was a very elusive watch. We haven't really seen too many in the secondary market. Collectors are keeping them, and I think that's a testament to how special the watch is.
Yeah, they don't come around too often, that's for sure. And I think it's an interesting watch from an artisanal standpoint because whereas the silicon is created by, DRIE, it's a computer-controlled, machine-guided process, it produces parts that are very durable but also cannot be manually finished. Whereas with the compliant mechanism, one of the reasons that Patek did opt for that somewhat divisive dial cutout is that these are now metal parts.
Right.
And metal can be manually finished, and it was finished to be beautiful. So even if it is perhaps not as cutting edge as silicon, there are innovations there.
And you see the mechanism activating.
It's visually spectacular, but you can also beautify it in a traditional sense. This is a mechanism that could still qualify for the Geneva hallmark. It's of that aesthetic.
Right. And, this takes us to 2021 with the launch of the 5750. And even more so than the 5650 and the others, this was a technology that was going to be utilized by very, very few watches. And the 5750 was a minute repeater model. The advanced research that was done, or the component that was added, was an acoustic enhancement. It was done because one of the critiques of minute repeaters in general is the volume. and how loud they are. And there's been different techniques over the years in order to, let's call it, increase the sound, right? Whether it's the case material or things like that. You know, very often when they present a minute repeater, they'll do so with a piece of paper in order to amplify the sound. But this was the first time that an actual component was added that would increase that sound.
Yes, and it's important to remember that when you have a precious metal watch, which is virtually every Patek Philippe minute repeater, you're going to have a deadening of the sound. It's not going to be, it might be lyrical and beautiful, beautifully tuned, like it might have a wonderful melodious quality, but it's going to be quiet. And here we're taking the resonator and we're basically decoupling it from the case so that a platinum watch can be as loud as a titanium watch. And I've heard shatteringly loud minute repeaters from Jaeger-LeCoultre, Armand Strom, Gerard Perregaux. They definitely broadcast their sound, but they're not sonorous the way a Patek has been traditionally. Now, because we have a resonator that connects the gongs to the case-back sapphire, we have the ability to get a minute repeater that can be heard, you know, at the time they were saying 60 meters away, which is insane.
It's wild.
But it's not simply a loud, shrill school bell. It is still a beautiful quality sound that would pass muster. It's going to sound as good as an older Patek repeater, just with more volume.
And the aesthetics are also very modern. Both the dial and the rotor have almost a traditional British racing inspiration behind them, that, you know, the spokes of a wheel. And, you know, again, I mean, to me, this is just them developing something because they can, and for the purposes of advancing the art of what they do, not necessarily that they need to integrate something that's going to go into every single piece.
Yeah, if they just wanted to make money, then the Advanced Research Series would be about nothing but Calatravas and the Ladies 24, because those are the volume sellers.
100%.
When you're making 15 pieces of a high horology experimental minute repeater, this is basically just you saying, look, back in 1951, you were not going to be part of the Gyromax testing group unless you were an engineer or a watchmaker at Patek Philippe. But today, if you want to sign up to be a guinea pig of sort at a high level, but if you want to be one of our beta testers, the Advanced Research Series is the place to be. And, you know, in 2021, that meant minute repeaters. That is an elite cadre. That's important, I think, for Patek to stay on the cutting edge of something that sets it apart, chiming watches, but it's not for going mass market.
Right, no. And I mean, and it's something that they do by far and away the best of relative to anybody else. And so I'm really excited to see what the next advanced research pieces are, because it really is always a surprise.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see if any of these innovations that we've seen since the 5550 go into mass production. Like, I'm wondering if now we've seen enough of Gyromax SI that we can get that exotic balance in a more traditional Calatrava, or if perhaps the compliant mechanism might find its way into the next generation Nautilus travel time chronograph or Aquanaut travel time, or maybe even a successor to something like the 5134. I'm really interested to see where that might go. Do we want to like take a bet and see what the next innovation in advanced research might be, or perhaps project where they might go in the future?
You know what? I mean, it's what's interesting is that I would have never even guessed that the advancement would have been what they did for the minute repeater. So I don't know how much more there is to do in terms of material itself, whether it's movement components. I feel like they and others have really pushed the boundaries as far as that can go. But I tend to agree with you. I think that it's taking pre-existing complications and perhaps making the mechanisms of them a lot more efficient, which allows them to make them thinner and smaller.
I would love to see a world where maybe Patek Philippe tries to tackle the 800-pound gorilla that's foiled a lot of others, which is to create a high-frequency silicon oscillator. With their expertise in the technology and now the decades of experience forming parts, I think that if anyone can make this work, it would be Patek Philippe. We've seen a few false starts, but it's got to succeed somewhere, and hey, we're just prognosticating. Anything could happen. I definitely think that a monoblock oscillator that replaces, for example, the escapement, the hairspring, the balance mass, that could be the next step that perhaps the Silicon series started. That could be the next generation of what a Silomax was in its day.
No, I mean, that would be fantastic. And, you know, again, only time will tell. I just want to thank everybody for tuning in to Perpetually Patek on Advanced Research Watches. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Thank you for logging on.